Welcome to BABYLONIan 5. So this is the first of my Crusade review videos, and I've decided to adopt my normal slideshowy sort of view of the world to try and avoid copyright issues. I just think it gets the job done a little bit faster. And Crusade is an interesting series. If you've already watched my sort of introductory video on what happened with Crusade, you'll know that it had a very sort of difficult birth and a very short life. So I thought that for this series, as there are only 13 episodes, I'm just going to do it off the cuff, basically. I'm not going to type out a script. I'm just going to sort of run through my screen captures and just give you some thoughts on what happens in each episode. And the other thing about Crusade is there isn't necessarily a single established viewing order. You'll see that I've started off with the sort of the DVD menu screen, because that is the order that I'm going to take it in, because that's what appears on the official DVD. So I'm hoping that this is a reasonably sensible order to do it in. And this first episode, called Warzone, does make sense as a first episode because it seems to be dealing with the assignment of all the crew to the Excalibur in the first place. So obviously that's a logical place to start, and it also recaps the events of A Call to Arms and is basically an immediate flow through from A Call to Arms. I'm just reminding myself from the back of the disc that this is set in 2267, and interestingly, the president who was the president at the end of season 4 of Babylon 5 is still the Earth president, Susan Lashensko, I think her name was. So I'm not quite sure how long her term would be, but she must have been put in position. Well, I need to be careful here. I don't want to. Crusade is very difficult not to spoil you for Babylon 5 because it follows on naturally from a point after Babylon 5's 5-year run. So I'm going to have to assume that you are somewhat familiar with the Babylon 5 universe, but I will try and restrict myself to comments that are sort of directly relevant to what's happening in the Crusade episode. So that way, although there will be some spoilers for Babylon 5, I will try and minimize them. I'll do what I can with that. But basically, we're reminded that the Drac, who are allies of the Shadows, have done a hostile fly past of Earth, and although their forces were basically driven off, it was not before they managed to inflict a sort of some sort of plague on a planetary scale onto Earth. And we hear that Earth ships are still in pursuit of various Drac vessels, but basically Matthew Gideon's ship has been called back to Earth. And interestingly, I didn't remember this, but it's an Explorer class vessel, of which we've seen very, very few in the series, and we're told that anyone who sees one will actually be lucky to see more than one in their lifetime. So that implies that his ship must have been relatively close to Earth to respond as quickly as it has done, because there's still cleanup operations going on in orbit as the ship arrives. But the first thing we see him having to do is put down a mutiny on his own ship because people don't want to go back to Earth. So basically, people are just losing it, and they've lost military discipline on in 2 seconds flat, it seems, which is not ideal. And we learn that his second in command, John Matheson, has his back and is trying to sort of slow up the mutineers so that he can get a chance to get in position to intercept them himself. And he takes down the ringleader. So he's clearly quite a hands-on kind of guy. He's not afraid of conflict, and he's not afraid of taking stuff on directly if he needs to, which is interesting, because the ship is then called to Mars, and interestingly, it actually opens a jump point to Mars. And off the back of that, he's then met by a senator who basically tells them that they're going to be needed for a rather special mission. Now, just before we carry on, I just want to run through some of the the introduction sort of video sequence, because it's quite interesting. Because again, if you know your Babylon 5, this is a mix of questions. So we have the "Who are you?" from the Vorlons, we have the "What do you want?" from the Shadows, but then we also have a new one, which is "Where are you going?" and that gets addressed later in the episode. We also have "Who do you serve?" and "Who do you trust?" and both of those two last ones are asked by a certain technomage, who again we've seen in the Call to Arms. Now, I was doing captures of the main recurring characters and who plays them, and it's quite interesting because Tracy Scoggins is here as a recurring character as Captain Elizabeth Lockley, which immediately tells you that they're going to go to Babylon 5 at some point, so that's predictable. But how she then shows up enough to become a regular character, I'm not sure. I do remember her being in a few episodes, but not many. But we've got Peter Woodward, that's right, so we have got him as Galen in the opening sequence there. There's some nice little snippets in the opening sequence, like they show the Thunderbolt launch system that they've got, which is quite unusual. So if you remember, Babylon 5 had Cobra Bays, which had sort of gantries that dropped down through 90 degrees, and then the Star Furies was kind of flung out from the station in that way. But of course, the Excalibur doesn't have centrifugal force on its, for its benefit. So they're either launching out of a launch bay, or they're being sort of decanted, for want of a better word, on a sort of vertical strut, and then they can then launch away from that under their own power. So it's quite a sort of novel little launch system they've got there for sort of rapid deployment. We've got Dorina coming back as well from A Call to Arms, played by Carrie Dubrow. There are some names here that I do kind of recognise. Margene Holden I kind of recognise, and Daniel Day Kim I think he ended up in Hawaii Five-0, the sort of the redo of that series. And Gary Cole, I remember from way back. I can't remember what the series was called now. It was a sort of fantasy series. I think he was like a devil sort of character. I think he was also the Midnight Caller, of course, as well, way back in the day. I think that was him. Interestingly as well, we also have a newsreader here for ISN who will be familiar, I think. Pretty sure she was in Babylon 5 as well. So we've got quite a few people, quite a few sort of familiar faces coming in here. But of course, we're also going to get introduced to new characters who we haven't seen before. So interestingly, the Explorer ship actually jumps to Mars. It doesn't try and go there in normal space. It actually jumps out and jumps back into Mars space. And we see that Galen, the Technomage, is sort of monitoring its progress already. And then we also see that a Drax ship is getting chased down, although somewhat unsuccessfully, by an Omega-class destroyer. I didn't make out the name. But basically, it's actually very sensibly got, the Drax ship very sensibly has got aft-firing guns. So although the Medusa is, not the Medusa, that was in the credits, but although the Earth Force Omega class is chasing it down, it doesn't seem to have any weapons left. So it's literally just trailing it for some reason. And then it launches a distress buoy just before it crashes and burns. Intended to alert other Earth ships to the fact that this Drac vessel is going down on what turns out to be SETI 4, which is an IPX expedition site. And you may remember, if you're a Babylon 5 fan, that of course IPX are not generally associated with the warm and fuzzies, because they generally have their fingers in quite sort of dark projects and the retrieval of alien tech that may or may not end up being a good thing. And here we meet Matt Eilerson, who is going to be a member of the crew, and he's leading the archaeological expedition as the Drax ship crashes a distance from his camp. And we see that there definitely are survivors. We then switch back to Mars and saying Gideon gets his briefing. And there's a little subtitle that notes that Mars is an independent member of the Earth Alliance, which of course it is these days, but wasn't originally. So the Explorer vessel jumps in there, and he then gets briefed by a senator who basically says they need the best captain they can get. and he's had a lot of first contact experience, but by the same token, they know damn well that he will do what needs to be done to get the job done, so he isn't going to pull his punches, which is also what they need. Because what they don't want is Earth turning into a new Mars in 5 years' time, because everyone's been killed off by the time that the Drak plague has managed to adapt itself to life on Earth. So, again, this episode is very much sort of setting up the backstory. It's setting up that there's urban, disruption going on Earth. People aren't going to work. People are protesting, rioting, all that sort of bad stuff. So something needs to be done, and Gideon is going to be sent out in the prototype Excalibur, and tasked with doing whatever needs to be done to save Earth. And then we see that quite a few Drak have actually survived on Ceti 4, and they take out the expedition's shuttle with concentrated fire from hand weapons that indicate that clearly their intentions are pretty bloody hostile, actually. And so there's a shuttle pilot who decides that he's going to take their last remaining shuttle up into orbit to try and get a signal out, whilst the others kind of pack up and prepare to leave, because they just don't see they have any other choice. They can't reach anyone otherwise, and they feel it's, given that the Drak didn't try and communicate with their shuttle before it got shot down, they're obviously not interested in talking. They just want whatever it is that they want, and they've got hostile intent. So we also now meet Dr. Chambers on Mars, who is very keen to get back to Earth, because despite the plague, she's got her sister back there, and as we later learn, her niece. So she's got a very sort of human link to want to do something to help. And until now, she hasn't been told why she's on Mars. She's just been cooling her heels, so she's not very impressed. But she ends up on the team, and of course, as does our friend Durina from A Call to Arms, the thief. And the senator initially sort of dismisses her because she's been trying to get in, and they've been trying to restrain her unsuccessfully, as it turns out. But Gideon accepts that he needs her, and he basically recruits her himself. And the hotshot pilot, I think his name was Reese, takes off from Ceti 4 as the rest of the expedition move to a safer location, or what they hope is a safer location. And then, interestingly, the Gideon goes up to the Excalibur, mentioning that it's at 1.25 miles long, so a big ship. But Durina, of course, has already been on it, so she sort of says it'll do, and I wonder if that's a sort of wry comment on her part, because she's actually already been on it in A Call to Arms, of course. Or on this, yeah, it was that one she was on, yeah. So it's nothing new to her, so she's not that fussed about it, basically. But we see a little bit of the interior of the ship's sort of hangar bay, and we see that there are Star Furies sort of ready to go in its hangar bay, which presumably is pressurized. And then they jump out, and we see that there's a strange sort of delta triangular shaped ship that's moving with them, which they don't seem to detect. But we gather very quickly that it's Galen's ship, and Galen just tells his ship to pursue, and so it does. So it moves into hyperspace with the Excalibur, and although the Excalibur was initially on its way to a sort of testing ground, the pilot from the expedition has managed to establish that there's another distress signal being sent, which is the Earth Omega Destroyer's beacon. So he goes and grapples onto that so that he can sort of rejig it and try and boost his own signal. So off the back of that, the Senator gets in contact with Excalibur again in hyperspace. They get rerouted immediately to Ceti 4, and at that point, Gideon makes contact with Galen makes contact with Gideon, but anonymously. So it's just his voice, there's no audio, and he doesn't tell him who he is. And he basically just says that he sort of reassures him that he will be there when he's needed. But it just kind of leaves Gideon a bit puzzled, and he gets Matheson, who we've established instantly is a telepath. And the interesting thing about him is that it was a slight reach to get him onto the crew, it seems, because there has been a change in the way that telepaths are dealt with in Earth Force. So he's not Psychor, which is interesting to start with. And we don't find out any more than that this episode, but basically Gideon refers to there being new rules for telepaths. So whatever it is that's happened, Matheson is playing nicely with it, but we don't know exactly what it is at this point. We just know that something's shifted. We also see now as well that I'd forgotten this little detail as well, that because the ship is 1.25 miles long, it has these little sort of transit tunnels in it. So you get into a sort of a little, like a sort of little bullet car, and they shoot you along at high speed inside the ship to get you from point A to point B. And they sort of discuss the mission and whether or not there might be any risk of contamination and so on when they're on board one of these little pods. Called a travel pod, I guess. And then we see that a great big expeditionary force goes down, and this is just as well because the Drak are on the move in numbers, and Allison's team have taken refuge in this sort of alien sanctuary, alien city that they found, and is hoping that they won't be spotted. But clearly they are, they are going to get spotted because they've seen that the force is moving on them. And fortuitously at that point, Gideon calls down to him and says basically, "We're here, where are you?" And Gideon's thunderbolts are then dispatched to deal with the ground force that's approaching their position. So that situation is resolved fairly rapidly, apart from the fact that a Councillor Lashan, who is on board the downed Drak ship, is going to get his own reinforcements very shortly because there are Drak ships coming in through hyperspace. So we're facing a conflict on two fronts. So Gideon and Allison immediately don't particularly get on because Allison expects to have things his way and it doesn't work like that. So he's sent off to the Drak ship to translate anything that needs translating and generally to secure prisoners amongst any Drak that are left over, whilst Gideon is flown back up to the Excalibur to try and intercept the incoming enemy ships. Although he does get out to the Drak ship himself first, and Dorina proves her worth because she basically manages to flank a whole squad of Drak who are otherwise pinning them down with their with hostile fire, but she manages to blow a grenade up in their faces, which is a useful methodology for getting rid of them. And we see too that Galen is on the ground now. He's come down to help, and he takes out a few Drak quietly in the background, including one that was about to shoot Gideon in the back as he was making his way back up to the ship. So we see that he is going to take quite an active role in things, using his skill set. And we then see quite an interesting sequence actually where there's no verbal communication going on. All it is an action sequence of the Excalibur taking down multiple Drak ship and using its main guns just to remind us that it has them. So it fires its concentrated burst of fire to destroy a Drak ship that's put itself on a collision course because it's basically so wrecked it can't do anything else. And whilst the Excalibur is dealing with business in orbit, the ground team successfully find the Councillor and detain him. So all in all, this initial mission is a success. The curious thing about this episode is that it's production number 108, which suggests that it was produced quite late on, and yet it's clearly chronologically should be the first episode in the series. I'm not quite sure why that happened. And make a mental note about the uniforms that are being used here as well, because we have black uniforms with a little bit of red underneath them. This I will draw attention to later in the series as different things happened on the uniform front. Allison helps to interrogate the Drak, although it turns out he actually knows and can speak English perfectly well when he chooses to, and basically says he considers himself a prisoner of war, but he's going to get sent back to Earth which means he's going to get infected by the same plague that he's infected Earth with. So he's going to have a degree of incentive to cooperate, should he choose to. And interestingly, he asks Gideon a question, well, two questions in fact, because he says that when Earth is gone, who will you serve and who will you be? So that's very interesting, because they used to work for the Shadows, who just say what you want. But the Drak are used to serving, because they are servants, generally speaking. They are now their own masters in many respects. But he's asking him, who will you serve and who will you be when your masters are dead? So that's quite an interesting little sort of twist in the tale there, in terms of the usual questions, the usual sort of existential questions that we get asked. And then Gideon finds out that the audio signal that the Excalibur received from Galen before was from a place that he knows very well, because he says that he nearly died there 9 years ago. So he was rescued 9 years ago, floating in space in an EVA suit by a techno mage. And of course we then discover that techno mage is Gideon. So they have history. We also find that Dr. Chambers is sending a message to her sister and her niece down on Earth, and she's clearly very determined to look after them and secure both of their welfare by completing her mission. So clearly, sort of relationship stakes in getting the mission done for her. So Gideon goes down to a very sort of Earth-like planet, and he meets with Galen. And Galen explains that the other technomages have basically booted him out now, because he's been helping too much with other people. Basically, he's been putting his neck on the line too much, and they fear that he's going to reveal their hiding place. Quite why they're still hiding when the Shadow War is now over, I don't know. But he asks Gideon his questions, which are, what he actually asks him, what do you want? Which is a very shadowy question to ask. But he says to find a cure for the Drak plague, and he says, where are you going? He says, anywhere I need to. And he asks him, who does he serve and who does he trust? And Gideon doesn't initially answer that, and Galen asks him again. And he basically says, I don't know. And Galen says, then I will come with you. So, interestingly, the fact that he doesn't give him a definitive answer to that question is perfectly acceptable. And it may well be that Galen feels that he can either sort of use that ambiguity, or that ambiguity is going to help get the job done, basically. So we have now assembled all of the sort of the core team, if you like, that Galen originally pulled together for a call to arms. Plus we have Matheson, we have Gideon, we also have Alison as well. So he's going to get drafted in as the IPX linguistic xenoarchaeology sort of specialist, who they may well need in their missions as they explore worlds they haven't gone to before. And so it begins, which is exactly what Galen says at one point early on in the episode, in a very sort of Vorlon-esque fashion. So there are a lot of, Babylon 5 doesn't really get mentioned in this at all, and it doesn't need to be, because this is standalone. But those who have watched Babylon 5 before will understand what on earth's going on much better than most other people would do. And we don't know if they're going to need the 5 years to find a cure to the Drak plague. We just know that at the moment that's the best guess for when it goes active. So there is a certain sort of pressure on them to move along and not spend too long in any one place to try and find the cure. I noticed that some what looked like Starship Trooper uniforms were getting reused. I think I saw them in Firefly once as well. So there's obviously a sort of a costume hire place where you can get sort of previously used Hollywood style props, and I guess you'd have to do that as a cost and time saving exercise from now and again. But this was quite an action packed episode as they go. I mean, obviously the CGI at this point in time is that much further along than it was when Babylon 5 was going through its main run. So they can do a lot of stuff with it now quite straightforwardly. I mean, a lot of the models here are ships that we're familiar with, so they haven't had to do too many extras. But they are definitely ramping things up. I mean, even using sort of CGI Drac is unusual. I wasn't quite sure whether or not the actual sort of planetary renderers were quite as believable when they're actually sort of on the ground. They looked a bit too smooth somehow, but you've got to bear in mind this was very late 90s. It's not going to be as it would be in today's rendering, you know, so you've got to make some allowances there for that sort of thing. I'm just trying to think if there is any. Just looking at my notes, but basically, you know, this is all classic initial episode scene setting, character establishment. Ideally, you would watch A Call to Arms before you start watching Crusade, just because it gives you that much more background. And I mean, obviously, ideally, you'd watch Babylon 5 first as well, because then you'd be more comfortable with the universe. But I think as sort of introductions go, this is a good setup because it does cover as much as you need to understand what Crusade was setting out to do, how long it was likely to last, and who all the main characters are. And those of us who are familiar with the Babylon 5 backstory will pick up on more small details, like the telepath rules having changed somehow. That's interesting for those of us who know. But you know, otherwise it is, you know, pretty standalone. You can sort of, you know, pick it out fairly easily. As you will know, I'm quite keen on my sort of ship tech and that sort of stuff. And what we see with Excalibur in this episode is that it's got sort of targetable Gatling guns. It's got a sort of single shot weapon of some sort mounted just on its nose that can sort of lift up and target independently of its direction of travel, which again is handy. 3 sort of main White Star-esque beam weapons at the front, and of course its uber weapon that fires from the ends of its wings, converges beyond its nose, and then kicks out a single beam that can take out pretty much everything going, but that powers down the ship for a full 60 seconds. So that's very much weapon of last resort because it leaves the ship very vulnerable. It doesn't have energy shields as such, but its hull can refract most energy weapon fire that is fired at it. So it can hang in a fight for a lot longer than a normal Earth ship can, because it's a blend of sort of Vorlon Minbari Earth technology. So it's by far and away the most advanced ship Earth still has available to it. And it will also have backup from the Rangers as well as it goes from the Anlast Shock. So a little bit different to how I normally do these run throughs, but I thought this might be a little bit quicker for me because we've got the road home coming at the time of recording. So I'm kind of hoping I might be able to get some of Crusade kind of in the bag before the road home arrives, because obviously I'm going to want to look at that in some detail just to see what they're doing with it. And again, at the time of recording, it seems to be doing really well for pre-sale. So with a little bit of luck, if it does well, JMS is saying that you know, we could see 1 or 2 animated Babylon 5 features a year if it does sell really well. Maybe if it goes well enough, you know, we will get a full-on reboot of some description, but that one's kind of, you know, more for a later date. So I hope you've enjoyed that quick sort of run through of this first episode, which I hope is the genuine sort of first episode, called Warzone. Do check out other videos on my Babylon 5 playlist. There's quite a lot of stuff on there now. I've done all 5 seasons, all the films. When I finish with Crusade, I will do Lost Tales. Then I'll do The Road Home. There are a few videos on The Road Home already, just based on the trailer. So do like and subscribe to the channel. And I will see you again, hopefully before too much longer, with another Crusade review. Cheers for now.